Welcome to another Drawing in the Dark. My name is Levi Smith. I draw and tattoo for a living. And today we're going to draw Indiana Jones. I always start by blocking out a few shapes for the figure, starting with the torso, and keeping my line work very light, especially when using a ballpoint pen. I wanted to get something more out of the dynamics in this pose and ended up with something pretty interesting here. Using a simple method of cylinders and spheres for the limbs and joints allows me to construct this figure pretty quickly. And a trick to drawing dynamic figures is to push the limbs out as far as you can from the center mass of the figure. And my go-to, the rod-gon method of mapping out the face, this is a simplified Loomis method I've been using for a while now. I want the figure to have a high sense of action, so I'll focus more on him than the background elements in this one. As I get the figure worked out, I can start to add some clothes, remembering that they are layers over the figure. Clothes can be used to suggest movement, weight, and dimension to the figure overall. I keep everything loose and light in these early stages, as I'm just trying to figure out placement and proportion of elements before I get into the details and finish lines. As you can see, I've sped this one up 5 times, but that's as far as I've actually had to go with this piece, which ended up being pretty efficient in its process. My materials here are never fancy, ballpoint pen and an Illo sketchbook, but any paper will do. As I get more involved with the layers of elements, I want to be more deliberate in the lines that I use to minimize confusion in these more complex areas. And I want to know what the figure is doing in the scene and plot out other elements such as this broken rope bridge that Indy is hanging from. This piece is a great example of how important the fundamentals are in understanding the structure and proportion of the figure. Once a general figure is worked out, it can be turned into any character you want. At first, I didn't worry too much about what the figure was doing, but as things take shape, I realize the potential for an interesting scene. I figure this right hand is perfect for a whip. I keep the rope bridge simple and primitive, and give a couple of simple clues to show that it's broken. And just to fake a bit of perspective, I make the top of the bridge a little narrower than the bottom, but nothing too extreme. Getting back to his face, I'm always amused at how goofy this understructure looks at first, and how it just dissolves into the face as it's developed. I'm not worried about it looking like Harrison Ford, just feeling like Indiana Jones. And just like with everything in this process, I'm working from the most general features to the specific ones. And I can't seem to escape this awkward left-hand situation here. I think I made the wrist a bit too long and I couldn't quite get the general shape right, though I do think it works out in the end, with a bit of heavy shading to hide some of these errors. Hands never get easier though. I often find it's easier to have the figure holding something. The scene is starting to feel like he's just about to swing to safety. The classic Indiana Jones style. To fill the composition and suggest a setting, I sketch out some kind of canyon walls and later add on an additional bridge to it, just to give a sense of the scene and help describe the situation Indy is in here. Here we are with the general concept mapped out. Often this is as far as a sketch like this would go, but for the sketchbook, I'm going to carry out the exercise until it feels done. It's come together pretty well so far, and I like where it's headed. Indiana Jones was created in 1981 by George Lucas and Philip Kaufman, and originally appeared in the film Raiders of the Lost Ark. He has appeared in 5 movies, a television series as a younger version, and comics published since his year of creation, novels set before the films, as well as adaptations of the films themselves, and I guess a few video games as well. Indiana Jones was inspired by adventure serials of the 1930s and 40s, such as Lawrence of Arabia and James Bond, and centered around mythical artifacts such as the Ark of the Covenant, Sankara stones, the Holy Grail, and crystal skulls. While fighting Nazis wasn't the focus of Indiana Jones's adventures, they happen to intersect quite a bit by nature of their shared era and interest in mythical artifacts of great power, of which Indy was always ready to get in the way of any plans the Third Reich had for such objects. In working on this kind of piece, I had to decide if I wanted him to look like Harrison Ford in particular, or just similar enough to resemble Indiana, which is the direction I went, particularly because there isn't a lot of room in a head this size for that level of detail. And while Indiana has some details to his costume, it's all still pretty straightforward. I grew up with Indiana Jones. The first movie I remember distinctly is Temple of Doom, which is my favorite one still, and always loved Short Round, played by Ke Huy Quan. Though as a kid, I never quite realized that he also played Data in Goonies. But those kinds of adventures through ancient ruins and lost civilizations is the kind of stuff that gets my imagination going wild. Ancient, lost, mythical, fantasy civilizations have always been a strange passion for me, from when I was a little kid, hearing about Atlantis, Troy, and ancient Greeks and stuff, even like the Easter Island civilization. I've been in love with these concepts for so long that I find myself wanting to create my own, getting into world building and storycraft just for the sake of it. As well as exploring all of the fringe topics from like ancient aliens, lost advanced civilizations, alien worlds, and their possible influence on human development. Even as I can think my way around these notions, I still find them wildly entertaining. As an old D&D player, and particularly a dungeon master, my favorite part of the process was building the adventure scenarios, and drawing the maps, characters, and obstacles the players would interact with. It eventually got to the point where I stopped building D&D adventures though, and started making comics and writing stories and stuff, just to have more control of the outcomes and process, as players will often derail or modify a tightly crafted adventure plan, and that was something that I was often frustrated by, especially like in my high school days. And to this day, I still draw world maps and town maps and think of various civilization concepts. I just can't help it. If I'm in a relaxed, comfortable place in my head, that's usually the stuff that my mind drifts towards. There's a scene at the very end of Raiders of the Lost Ark where the Ark is put into a crate and shipped to an insane government warehouse for safekeeping, and I'm pretty sure that ending scene is the inspiration for the TV show Warehouse 13, one of my favorite shows of all time, and I at least will continue to believe as much. I haven't seen the latest Indiana Jones movie though, Dial with Destiny, and I'm in no hurry. Some of these older creative properties, such as James Bond and Indiana Jones, I really feel should remain in their original times, and new editions should also be set in those time periods, even if an iconic character has to be recast, as far as I'm concerned. As far as being an older Gen X fan of a lot of the current pop culture before it was current pop culture, I have a lot of opinions on how it's treated in a modern context. From the continuation of various game properties like D&D and Magic the Gathering, 80s cartoons like He-Man and G.I. Joe, comic books, Marvel DC, and how they've joined TV and movie franchises like Star Wars and Star Trek, and how they should be defined, evolved, and continued, and how preciously I hold them, which is much less now than it was in the past. But the volume of content available on any of these properties was so much smaller 20 to 30 years ago, and as such was so much easier to define in a clear way. Now these properties are massive and reach international audiences. The amount of actual content available on any given property is nearly too much for any individual to actually consume, and invariably conflicts with itself as fictional work, especially on the scope of a lot of these projects. And the process of how they evolve isn't a one-size-fits-all. And perhaps many of them would be better off left alone. Products of their time, exhibits of the past. But then I don't really know, as some of these properties flourish and end up better in their modern era than how they even started. Where Indiana Jones fits into all that, I don't know, time will tell. Is it too good to be remade like Back to the Future or the first Crow movie? Or something that would really benefit from a new take, new cast, and more contemporary worldview? I don't think so. The shading is straightforward here, lighting from the top right of the piece and more focused on the figure work and clothing layers. I keep all the shading in the background as light as possible while still building up some clear contrast in the depth effects in the canyon walls. This piece took just about 1.5 hours in real time to draw out and shade. Not long at all compared to many of the pieces I've been doing, but then I didn't shade this one to the same level that I did for the V for Vendetta or even the GI Robot episodes. Thank you for making it to the end of the video. It would mean a lot if you gave the video a like and subscribe to the channel if you're interested in seeing more stuff like this. We've got t-shirts, art prints, art books, free comics online, and a Patreon page for all the behind the scenes and early access to a bunch of content and projects. All the links for that stuff are in the description. Thanks for stopping by, and check us out in the next video. I've got a few how to draw robot videos coming next.